Hello everyone, Panzer J back with a new video. This video is going to be on Axis and Allies Europe, and this game came out in 1999. So it came out obviously after the classic 80s version of Axis and Allies, which covered the entire war. So that was a global game. But this particular version came out prior to the rush of these board games that came out in the early 2000s up into present day. And this one focuses on, as the title, Axis and Allies Europe, it's just focusing on the European theater of the conflict. So it's a much smaller map, less countries are involved. The same number of units, though, really. This game did introduce, at the time, a couple of new units, such as the destroyer and I believe artillery was new. If you compare it to, like I said, the classic 80s version of it. So a couple of new units got introduced, and also new sculpts too, whereas the old 80s game just kind of had the same sculpt for each country, for each unit, and then just color coded to that specific country. Here, there was the introduction of actually different sculpts for each country. I mean, some of them overlap, but at least they did a good job making at least some different sculpts for each country. So that adds some authenticity to the game a little bit. So again, this is just the European theater. So we've got Germany taking on the Soviet Union, the British, and the United States. So just on the surface of it, that might seem like, well, extremely difficult to prevail as Germany, as you're taking on three countries. You don't have the Japanese involved to maybe drain United States resources over in the Pacific. You don't have Italy. I mean, although Italy is, in a sense, in the game, I mean, they're just represented basically by German units. So, Italy obviously isn't a separate playable player, but the units that would have been Italian are just basically German. So it's not like Germany's being shortchanged the number of forces it has under control. They're just German instead of being Italian. So if we kind of take a look at the board a little bit, this is the initial setup to the game. So as you can see, there's a lot of black on the board, and that is all Germany. So this is prior to the invasion of the Soviet Union, but after France has fallen, and Norway, the Low Countries, all of southeastern Europe is under German control. So this would, the way this map is set up would be probably June 41, just prior to Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union. So as Germany, what are we looking at as far as challenges here? Well, obviously your biggest enemy right now, the one you're going to be dealing with the most from the start, is going to be Russia. So you've got units on the border with the Soviet Union, the Baltic states, East Poland, which the Russians incorporated into the Soviet Union in 1939. So you're going to have to go through those to start getting to actual original Russian territory. And as you can see, the Germans got quite a bit on the border. They got a handful of tanks spread out and a bunch of men. They also have some men in Finland and a bunch of men and a fighter in Norway. So I think if you're Germany, obviously you're going to attack right away. And I would assume that unless you had some really bad die rolls, that based on the ratio of forces here, you're probably going to be able to take out a bunch of these territories right from the jump here. Quite possibly the Baltic states, definitely East Poland, Bessarabia, and you can even come in here into Ukraine, SSR, right on, because you can see it borders with Romania. So you can bring this tank, you can even bring this tank over these men, maybe some air power, and you might be able to take out this territory from Russia right on turn one. So you're going to be fairly deep into Russia right away. Take out these border territories. You can come up here in the north, and with the forces in Finland, maybe take out Vyborg or Karelia. So you're definitely going to be able to take a chunk of Russian territory on Germany's first turn. And there's not a whole heck of a lot that the Western Allies can do to help. I mean, if you take a look, the United States, they're definitely strong economically. I believe they start out at $40 maybe, which is tied for the most in the game. But for units, all they've got is a transport, a destroyer, a bomber, a couple infantry, and a fighter. That's it. So the U.S. is extremely weak militarily to start this game. So they're not going to present much of a challenge, at least for a few turns. And then even the British don't have a lot. I mean, they do have typically, they do have the strong Navy going. But as far as ground and air units, they got a couple fighters, a bomber, a tank, and artillery, and like 4 men in England itself. And that's it for the European part of the map. They do have a tank over in Canada, but I mean, that's hardly going to bother the Germans, honestly. And then even the British naval units aren't as strong as you might think. Because if you look at the board, look at all the German U-boats that are on the board. You got one up here in the Barents Sea. You got one here in the Denmark Straits. One in Halifax Sea. One in the Mid-Atlantic. One in the South Atlantic. One in the Azores Seas. 2 in the Bay of Biscay. And then you've even got 2 over here outside of Germany itself. So that's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. That's 10 subs in the Atlantic to start the game. So the Germans are going to be able to take out a bunch of these British ships before the British even get their turn. So you're going to put a hurting on the British naval force right from the get-go. And then if we look down into North Africa, even down here, the Germans in fairly good shape. The British do have some more ships in the Med. They've got a destroyer outside Gibraltar and a destroyer and a transport outside of Egypt. And they do have some units in the Mideast, Iraq and Syria and whatnot. But the Germans have a few units in Tunisia, which I would again assume those would represent Italians for the most part. But the Germans do have a battleship and a destroyer in the Med. So they already have a stronger naval presence. That battleship is, way stronger than either of the destroyers the British have. And they also have a transport there, so they can start bringing some of the units they have in Italy. They got a couple of stacks of men in northern and southern Italy, some tanks, an artillery, a fighter. So even in Africa, the Germans are going to be able to go on the offensive pretty quick. And there's no factories or anything down here for the British. I haven't played this game in quite a while, so I'm going to have to read the rules and get caught back up. I don't know if the British can put a factory down in Africa or not, but if you assume that they can't, then the Germans definitely have the advantage because they've got this transport here, all these units that are like 2 spaces away to land in Africa. The British have to take transports and bring them all the way from England all the way down to Africa itself. So unless they can build a factory, which I'm not sure about, the Germans would definitely have the advantage in Africa as well. Obviously, the U.S. would start building forces, transports, and whatnot to start bringing stuff over, whether that's in Europe or down here to Africa. But again, the Germans got such a strong U-boat presence in the Atlantic, you're going to have to spend money on destroyers as the British and the U.S. player just to combat the submarines. So even though it's kind of a 3-on-1 game here, the Russians, the British, and the Americans against just Germany, I actually think Germany looks very strong from the opening setup of this game. I think the Germans actually can get deep enough into Russia and take enough of both the Russian income as well as Russian military units off the board before the British and the U.S. can really respond and apply pressure to the Germans, honestly. The Germans even have look at what they've got in Western Europe anyways. They don't even really have to put money into Western Europe. You've got like 4 men, a couple of tanks, a fighter and artillery in the Normandy territory. Then you got like 5 men in the interior of France and then like 3 more men and a couple of tanks in the Netherlands. So, I mean, just that force alone is fairly strong, especially if you like maybe consolidate all of that. Like, let's say maybe leave one guy in both the Netherlands and the Normandy territory along the coast, pull everything back to the interior of France. You're looking at like 4 tanks, an artillery, a fighter, and about 10 guys. So that even when the U.S. or the British, say, land in Normandy, which they would take that easily with just the one guy you left behind, you'd be able to counterattack with all that in the interior of France, which they can't touch until after they've landed in France itself. So, not to mention that it would take the British and the U.S. player, I would figure, several turns to even build up enough force, first defeating the U-boat menace, and then building up enough to actually land in France. So I think that Russia would really kind of be on their own for several turns in this game. Which would allow Germany to basically spend everything, maybe buy a few new U-boats here and there to keep up the pressure in the Atlantic. But then mostly what you're going to do is Germany, I would think, is buy ground and air units for the attack and battles in Russia itself. So I think you can really put Russia back on its heels right from the start of the game. So even with it being a 3-on-1 contest, it looks to me, at least from the opening setup, that actually Germany has the advantage in the game. We'll see. Hopefully I'll get to fire this game up soon, and we'll actually do a video on some gameplay experience from it. I mean, like I said, I could be wrong. Maybe Germany actually has more of a tougher go at it than it looks from this opening setup. Maybe there's some things that the Allies can do that I'm not quite thinking of right now. But it looks to me like maybe not a fairly easy German victory, but the odds favor Germany more than it does the Allies in this game. And then also with the game, you get the standard production chart. So as you can see, the Russians start out at 24, the British 25, and Germany and the United States 40 each. And that's the income tracker. So even though, I mean, economically, Germany and the United States equal each other at 40, and then you've got another $24, $49. So to start the game, the Allies are collecting collectively $49 more than Germany. But again, Germany's got so many more units already on the board, and the fact that they're already going to start eating into that Russian income right away, you're going to probably take 3, 4, maybe even 5 Russian territories on turn 1. So you're going to start flipping those odds right away in your favor, and Germany will then surpass the United States and go to top dog militarily right away. Then you also have the attacker-defender chart. And again, like, I believe it's the case of all Axis and Allies games, they all use 6-sided die. So unlike, for instance, historical board gaming, Global War use the 12-sided die for most combat rolls and determinations. Axis and Allies just use the 6-sided die. So you got the attacker down here. So on a 1, infantry and aircraft carriers would hit. On a 2, artillery and subs. On a 3, armor, fighters and destroyers. And on 4, bombers and battleships. And then if you look at the defender, I'm reading this upside down, but you got battleships and fighters at 4 or less, aircraft carriers and destroyers at 3 or less, armor, artillery, infantry and subs at 2 or less, and then anti-aircraft guns, the bombers and the transports at 1 or less. So that's the combat chart and the rolls needed to hit depending on what unit you have. And then finally we've got the setup charts for each country. And here's Germany to start. I believe they are first in turn sequence. There's not really any special units involved or any special rules per country. It's all just kind of like generic, the same across the board, both in terms of what the units attack and defend with and so forth. And then besides the Germans, you've got the British, the Russians, Soviet Union, and then the United States. And again, the setup charts are, at least the units are all generic to each country. As far as the sculpts go, like I said, you get some different sculpts, I think for the first time in the series of Axis and Allies games. So the Germans, for instance, artillery is new to this game, and the German artillery unit is represented by the famed 88, which really wasn't an artillery piece, but it was an anti-aircraft gun that the Germans did use in the ground role to take out armor, both in France when they encountered some of the Russian or the French heavy tanks, and then especially in the Soviet Union, taking on the KV-1, the KV-2, and the T-34 before the German anti-tank guns and the guns on the German tanks themselves were upgraded to be able to take on the heavier Allied armor units. But that is the famed 88. Then for the German fighters, here's something that's kind of weird. What they've got represented here is a Stuka dive bomber, the famous Ju-87. So that obviously is not a fighter. That was a, like I said, it was a dive bomber, ground support bomber that Germany used throughout the war. So that's kind of weird that they decided to represent a German fighter with a dive bomber, but that's cool. That's the first time I believe that the Stuka sculpt was represented in the game. And then you got the typical German infantry. The tank is a Panther. So that's, again, a little historically inaccurate. If this game is taking place in June 41, which we can deduce from the setup, the Panther didn't actually enter service until the summer of 1943. So that would not be available to this time. But again, it's not like the Panther has any increased attack or defense than the Allied tanks. Again, they're all generic across the board. So it's just simply the sculpt that represents Germany's tanks. For the Russians, we've got the typical Russian infantry. The tank is a T-34. The fighter, I believe, is a Yak. And then the heavy bomber is a different sculpt. So as you can see, if you compare them to like some of the German sculpts, they're different right across the board. So that's cool. Definitely, like I said, it definitely adds some authenticity if you can do sculpts based on actual units that country had during the war instead of just some generic sculpt that you apply to every country. And then for the British, we've got the Spitfire for the fighters. For the tank, we've got just a Sherman. So they've taken the U.S. Sherman, although the British did have Shermans in their inventory. So that isn't actually off at all. The British employed a sizable number of Sherman tanks in their forces. And I believe that's a Halifax heavy bomber the British got there. And then the U.S., I can't really show you a whole heck of a lot because they don't start the game off with too much, but you got a P-38 Lightning for the fighter. That's the sculpt for the U.S. infantry. And then the heavy bomber, destroyer, and a transport. So that's what the sculpts look like. And that's pretty much an overview of the game. Again, I can't give you any helpful tips or hints on gameplay or strategy at this point. I believe the last time I played this game was probably just after it came out, probably around 2000 or so. And then I hadn't had this game for the longest time. I just picked it up on eBay last week and got it set up here. So hopefully be able to get into a game here fairly soon, even if it's a solo one. And we'll get back to you with the results of that and maybe some more insight into the game a little bit. Take care, and we'll see you next time.